When did your kid get expelled from Disney World? My 9-year-old son Jameson got permanently banned from all Disney properties after causing $75,000 in damages during a Make-A-Wish event. The security chief's voice was trembling when he called. Sir, your son has destroyed a parade float and attacked Goofy. We need you here now before police arrest him. I could hear chaos, kids screaming, sirens, someone shouting about evacuating Fantasyland. Jameson had been invited by his classmate whose Make-A-Wish was to take his whole class to Disney. As a single dad between jobs, I could never afford Disney. Jameson was thrilled, wore his only nice outfit, practiced taking photos with characters all week. When I arrived, security had cordoned off Main Street. The princess float was on its side, hydraulic fluid everywhere. Goofy's costume head was ripped off, the employee inside holding his ribs. Tinkerbell's wings were in pieces across the street. In the middle sat Jameson, holding Mickey's severed ear, his nice shirt destroyed, knuckles bleeding from punching through fiberglass. The park manager was purple with rage. Your son is psychotic! He traumatized hundreds of children. This is felony destruction. Parents were filming everything. I recognized several from school, the ones whose kids had annual passes in Disney vacation homes. Jameson, what happened? I fixed something broken, Dad. The Make-A-Wish mother, Mrs. Harrison, stepped forward. Your son ruined my dying son's only wish. He destroyed the magic. We have footage. Jameson, explain. Now. He looked up calmly. Dad, they made certain kids be servants. The manager interrupted. We have a helper program where kids can earn special pins. Only the kids whose parents didn't pay for VIP guides had to be helpers, Jameson continued. The poor kids on the Make-A-Wish trip. My stomach dropped. Luis had to carry the rich kids' bags all day, in 95-degree heat. Amanda pushed wheelchairs for kids who could walk fine. Jose cleaned up trash while everyone else met princesses. For 8 hours. Mrs. Harrison shifted. It builds character. They made us wear special vests that said helper, so everyone knew we were the poor kids. We couldn't ride rides, meet characters, or eat until the VIP kids were done. They said it was part of the experience. Security was recording now, looking uncomfortable. The Make-A-Wish kid, Tommy? He has leukemia. They made him empty trash cans, while dying of cancer, because his wasn't the premium wish package. Other parents were backing away. During the parade, they made us stand behind barriers, holding everyone's souvenirs while VIP kids got front row. When Mickey came by, Tommy reached out. It's his last Disney trip ever. And security pushed him back, saying, character interaction is for VIP only. The Goofy performer spoke up weakly. Management said only interact with the wristband kids, the purple ones, not the helper vests. So when Tommy started crying, Jameson's voice broke, saying he just wanted to hug Mickey before he died, and they laughed. I snapped. The parade float? They announced the castle fireworks were VIP only. Make-A-Wish kids had to leave the park early. Tommy won't live to see another fireworks show. So I made sure nobody would. I looked at Mrs. Harrison. You paid extra to make dying children servants? She went pale. That's when I said the name that made her collapse. Jennifer Harrison. I know what really happened to your first husband, and why you changed your name. But that wasn't even the worst part. What security found in the VIP suite changed everything. Security Chief Benjamin Lewis pulled me aside before the Disney lawyers could swarm. His face looked gray, older than it had 20 minutes ago. He kept his voice low and his body angled to block their view. Mr. Davis, we found cameras in the VIP suite. Live feeds to monitors showing every helper kid in the park. They were watching them struggle. His hand shook slightly as he gripped my arm. The legal team is offering everyone refunds and lifetime passes to delete their footage. They're moving fast. This is bigger than a helper program. I watched 3 mothers across the cordoned area, accepting papers from suited Disney representatives, their phones already out, fingers moving across screens. One woman I recognized from Jameson's school was nodding, taking a thick envelope. The park manager stood nearby with his arms crossed, watching the parents like he was counting something. Benjamin pulled out his own phone and showed me a screenshot before quickly pocketing it again. I sent this to myself before they locked down everything. You need to see what your son was really fighting against. A woman in a dark blazer appeared through the crowd, her badge catching the emergency lights. Detective Lily Swift from Orlando Police moved with purpose, not the casual authority of park security. She stepped between me and the Disney staff forming around us. I need Mr. Davis separated from Disney personnel immediately. This is now a criminal investigation. Her voice carried across the chaos, making several lawyers freeze mid-conversation. She looked at Benjamin. Who called this in as potential child abuse? He raised his hand slightly and I saw his jaw set. She nodded once, then turned to me. Sir, I need your full statement before corporate attorneys can influence your memory of events. My unit handles exploitation cases. Come with me now. The Disney legal team started protesting, talking about protocols and procedures, but Swift was already guiding me toward the security office entrance. I glanced back at Jameson sitting on the pavement, and she followed my gaze. Your son will have a victim advocate with him. He's safe. But I need your statement first. Inside the security office, Detective Swift sat across from me with a notebook, not a tablet or recording device. Her pen was already moving before I started talking. I told her everything Jameson had said about Luis carrying bags in the heat, Amanda pushing wheelchairs until her arms gave out, Jose cleaning trash for 8 hours. I described the helper vests, the barriers, Tommy being denied access to Mickey Mouse because his wish package wasn't premium. Swift wrote down every name, circling some, drawing lines connecting others. Who organized this system? Her eyes stayed on her notes. I told her about Jennifer Harrison, about the VIP packages, about parents paying extra for their kids to get front row access while sick children worked. How much did families pay? I gave her the numbers I'd overheard, the amounts that made my unemployed stomach turn. Her expression darkened with each figure, her pen pressing harder into the paper. She asked about management's involvement, about cast member instructions, about how long this had been running. Every answer seemed to confirm something she already suspected. She flipped to a new page and kept writing. Through the window behind Swift, I could see Jameson with a woman in casual clothes, not a uniform. The victim advocate sat close to him, her posture relaxed, non-threatening. Jameson had papers spread in front of him and crayons in his hands. He was drawing, his head bent in concentration, occasionally looking up to explain something to the advocate. She nodded and handed him different colors. After several minutes, she gathered one of his drawings and walked toward our room. Swift paused her questioning as the advocate entered and placed the paper between us. Stick figures with rectangular vests labeled Helper stood behind thick black lines. On the other side, stick figures with circles on their wrists reached toward a larger figure with round ears. The Mickey Mouse figure's arms extended only toward the circled kids. The Helper kids had X marks over their hands. Jameson had drawn tears on one small figure holding a trash bag and written Tommy in careful letters above it. The advocate's voice was soft. He's been drawing what he witnessed for the past 30 minutes. This is the third picture. The others show similar scenes. Swift studied the drawing, then added it to her evidence folder. She resumed questioning, but her tone had shifted, colder and more precise. The door opened and a man in an expensive suit entered, his hand already extended toward Jennifer Harrison, who stood just outside. My client will not be answering questions. This is a civil property damage matter between Disney and the responsible party. He moved to position himself between Swift and the door. The detective didn't stand or react. She finished writing her current sentence, then looked up calmly. Your client organized a system where children, including terminally ill children, performed labor for 8 hours in exchange for access to an event they were already promised. That triggers mandatory reporting under Florida child abuse statutes. She tapped her pen on her notebook. Whether parents consented is irrelevant when the labor involves sick children being denied food, water, and medical considerations. I've already filed the report with Child Protective Services. This is now a criminal investigation regardless of Disney's property damage claims. The lawyer's confidence faltered slightly. He tried again, talking about consent forms and volunteer programs, but Swift cut him off. Forcing a child dying of cancer to empty trash cans while wealthy children are served champagne isn't a volunteer program. It's exploitation. Your client can cooperate now or wait for the warrant. My phone buzzed with a text from Benjamin Lewis. Hospital. Prudence giving statement. You should see this. I showed Swift and she nodded. We drove to the medical center in her unmarked car, leaving Jameson with the advocate and 2 uniformed officers she trusted. Prudence Lewis, the goofy performer, sat propped up in bed with her ribs wrapped, her face bruised where Jameson had fought to remove the costume head. But she was smiling slightly when we entered. I'm glad someone's finally asking about this. She pulled out her phone with her good hand and opened her email. Management sent explicit instructions 3 weeks ago. Cast members were told to interact only with purple wristband guests during character appearances. Children in helper vests were to be ignored, even if they approached us directly. She scrolled through messages, her finger stopping on one from a park coordinator. This one says helper children are not guests. They're event support staff and we should treat them accordingly. Swift photographed each email, her jaw tight. Prudence continued. We were told the tiered system was approved by Make-A-Wish and that helper families had volunteered. But I saw those kids. They weren't volunteering. They were exhausted and some were crying. She looked at me. Your son did what I wanted to do. I just didn't have the courage. Tommy's parents arrived at the security office just as we returned, their faces showing confusion shifting into horror. Tommy's mother kept saying she didn't understand, that they'd paid extra for the premium package to make Tommy's wish special. A park coordinator sat them down and explained, slowly and carefully, what the premium package had actually funded: the helper program, the tiered access system, the labor that sick children performed while VIP families watched from private viewing areas. Tommy's mother made a sound like something breaking inside her chest. We paid $5,000. We thought it was for better seats and character time for Tommy. She looked at her husband. We were in that suite. We were drinking champagne and eating catered food while our son emptied trash cans. Tommy's father had his head in his hands. They told us the helper program was separate, that those kids were from a different group. We never saw Tommy during the event because they said he was having special experiences. His voice cracked. What did we pay for? What did we do to him? The coordinator had no answer. Tommy's mother was sobbing now, her whole body shaking. He has leukemia. He's dying. And we paid people to torture him while we celebrated? She looked at me with such raw pain that I had to look away. Your son saved mine. We destroyed him. Benjamin Lewis found me in the hallway outside the security office and gestured for me to follow. We went down a corridor away from the main area, into a monitoring room with banks of screens. He pulled up footage on one monitor, checking over his shoulder twice before hitting play. The VIP suite appeared, luxurious and climate-controlled, with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the park. Jennifer Harrison sat on a cream-colored sofa with 3 other women, champagne glasses in hand. On the wall behind them, multiple screens showed live feeds from cameras throughout the park. I recognized the angles. They were focused on helper children. Luis carrying shopping bags, sweat-staining his vest. Amanda pushing a wheelchair, her thin arms trembling. Jose bent over a trash can, his helper vest too big for his small frame. The women were laughing. Harrison pointed at one screen and said something that made the others laugh harder. One woman raised her glass toward the screen showing Luis. They were toasting. Benjamin's voice was barely audible. Keep watching. Harrison pulled out her phone and the other women did the same. They were typing, comparing screens, laughing at whatever they were writing. Then I understood. They were betting. Betting on which child would quit first, would cry first, would collapse first. Treating suffering children like entertainment, like a game. Benjamin stopped the footage. Disney's lawyers will seize this within the hour, but I've already sent copies to my personal email, to Detective Swift and to 2 journalists I trust. His voice was steady. I'll lose my job. I don't care anymore. The footage continued playing and I couldn't look away, even though my hands were shaking. Harrison sipped champagne and pointed at a screen showing Tommy. He was barely strong enough to stand, his helper vest hanging off his thin shoulders, and he was struggling to lift a trash bag. The other VIP mothers were cheering, actually cheering, as he stumbled. One woman made a comment and they all laughed, the sound tinny through the security footage speakers. Another woman mimicked Tommy's weak movements, pretending to struggle with an invisible bag, and they laughed harder. Teaching them work ethic, one mother said, her voice caught by the suite's audio system. My kids need to see what happens when you don't have money. Harrison nodded, refilling glasses. Exactly. This is a learning opportunity for everyone. She gestured at the screens. These children need to understand their place. Our children need to understand theirs. It's just social education. Tommy collapsed on screen, falling to his knees beside the trash can, and the women applauded like he'd performed a trick. That's when I understood why Benjamin had called me first, before corporate, before the lawyers. He'd needed someone to see this who would care more about the children than about protecting the company. Detective Swift entered the monitoring room, and Benjamin immediately transferred the footage to her tablet. We watched Disney's legal team arrive in the hallway outside, 3 attorneys in dark suits talking urgently on phones. Swift secured the footage in her evidence app, encrypting it with passwords, backing it up to cloud storage that Disney couldn't access. She turned to Benjamin. You've already sent copies? He nodded. Personal email, journalists, backup drives in 3 locations. She smiled slightly. Good, they can't control this now. We walked out together, and I watched the attorneys' faces change as they realized what had happened. One lawyer's phone was already to his ear, his voice tight as he reported that the evidence was beyond their reach. Another was pulling up legal precedents on his tablet, his fingers moving fast across the screen. The third just stood there looking pale, probably calculating how many millions this would cost Disney in lawsuits and reputation damage. Benjamin stood beside me, his security chief uniform suddenly looking like armor instead of a costume. He'd chosen the children over his career, over his pension, over everything Disney could have offered him to stay quiet. Swift made a call to her captain, speaking in low tones about securing additional evidence before it could be destroyed. Lewis had sent copies to his personal email, knowing he would lose everything, but not caring anymore because some things mattered more than job security. Solomon Knight appeared beside me in the hallway, his park manager uniform perfectly pressed despite the chaos. He touched my elbow and guided me away from the other parents, his smile tight and practiced. We stopped near a janitor's closet where the noise from the security office became muffled background sound. Knight pulled an envelope from his jacket pocket, the Disney logo embossed on the cream paper. He explained that all damages would be waived, lifetime passes for my family and $50,000 in a settlement fund. His voice stayed calm, but his hands shook slightly as he held out the envelope. All I needed to do was convince Jameson to say this was a big misunderstanding, just a confused kid who got overwhelmed. Knight's desperation leaked through his professional mask like hydraulic fluid from that broken float. Disney knew this would destroy them if word got out about the helper program. Jameson had actually done something right by breaking those parade pieces. Edit. The corporation was more scared of the truth than the property damage bill. I looked at the envelope and then at Knight's sweating face. Jameson wasn't for sale and neither was I. Knight's expression shifted from pleading to something harder and colder. He reminded me that I was unemployed, that lawyers cost money I didn't have, that Disney's legal team could bury me in fees until I lost everything. His voice dropped lower and he stepped closer, invading my space in a way that felt like a threat. They would cooperate fully with any criminal charges against Jameson if I didn't take this deal. Knight seemed to grow larger as he spoke, his shadow falling across me in the fluorescent hallway light. I realized they were terrified not of Jameson destroying property, but of everyone learning why he did it. The truth about exploiting sick children mattered more to their brand than $75,000 in damages. Luis's parents pushed through the security office door, their faces showing panic and rage mixed together. His mother was crying and his father was supporting her weight as they walked. Luis sat in a wheelchair, an IV bag hanging from a pole attached to the chair. The paramedics had started fluids for his heat exhaustion. Blisters covered his small hands from carrying heavy shopping bags for 8 hours in 95-degree heat. His father spoke in broken English, explaining they thought they had to accept the helper role to qualify for the Make-A-Wish trip. They were immigrants who feared causing trouble, worried about their status and their son's access to charity programs. But now anger replaced that fear as Luis's mother looked at the VIP parents through the office window. Her hands clenched into fists, and she spoke rapidly in Spanish to her husband, her voice rising with each word. Amanda's grandmother arrived next, moving fast despite her age. She had raised Amanda while the girl fought bone cancer, taking on a second job to cover medical bills insurance wouldn't pay. The security officer tried to explain what happened, but she cut him off, demanding to see the VIP suite footage. Her hands shook with rage as she watched her granddaughter push wheelchairs until her thin arms gave out. Amanda had barely recovered from her last round of chemo, and pushing heavy wheelchairs for hours could have damaged her already weak body. The grandmother pulled out her phone and started making calls, her voice turning cold and precise. She was a retired lawyer, and she knew exactly who to contact. I heard her describe the exploitation in legal terms, building a case even as she stood in that security office. Her former colleagues would hear about this within the hour. Jose's father came through the door like a storm, his construction worker frame filling the entrance. He still wore his work clothes, concrete dust on his boots from the job site he'd left early. Taking unpaid time off had cost him, but he'd wanted to give Jose this special day. Someone showed him the VIP suite footage, and he watched the wealthy mothers laugh at his son struggling with trash bags. His fist went through the drywall before anyone could stop him, leaving a hole surrounded by cracks. Security officers moved toward him, but Detective Swift raised her hand to stop them. She said she would probably do the same thing if someone treated her kid like that. Jose's father stood with his bleeding knuckles pressed against his work pants, breathing hard and staring at Jennifer Harrison through the office window. Jennifer tried to leave, gathering her designer purse and smoothing her expensive dress. Detective Swift blocked the doorway, her police badge visible on her belt. Swift explained that Harrison wasn't under arrest, but she wasn't free to go until all statements were collected. Harrison's careful mask slipped and her real face showed through, twisted with contempt. She hissed that her lawyers would destroy everyone here, that she had connections these people couldn't imagine. Her voice rose loud enough for everyone in the hallway to hear. Swift didn't move from the doorway, just stood there with her arms crossed and her expression neutral. Harrison's lawyer appeared and started making demands about his client's rights, but Swift ignored him, focused entirely on Harrison's face. I spoke loud enough for everyone in both rooms to hear. Jennifer Hartley, wanted for questioning in her first husband's suspicious death in Connecticut 15 years ago. Harrison's face went white like someone had drained all the blood from her body. She demanded to know how I knew that name, her voice cracking on the last word. I told her I was very good at research when I had time on my hands, which I'd had plenty of lately between jobs. Those months of unemployment had given me time to dig into backgrounds of the wealthy parents at Jameson's school. Harrison had changed her name after her husband died in a convenient accident, right after he'd changed his life insurance policy. She'd disappeared before the investigation concluded, moving to Florida and reinventing herself as a charity volunteer. Detective Swift's interest sharpened like a blade being drawn. She stepped away and made a phone call, speaking in low tones while watching Harrison. Harrison's lawyer tried to shut this down, threatening legal action against me for slander. I kept talking, explaining that her husband had died in a car accident that investigators found suspicious. The insurance company had refused to pay out because of irregularities in the policy change. Harrison had filed false police reports about her husband's behavior before his death, building a narrative of an unstable man who might hurt himself. She'd disappeared 3 months after his death when Connecticut detectives started asking harder questions. The statute of limitations hadn't run out on insurance fraud and filing false reports. Swift's phone conversation lasted about 20 minutes while everyone stood frozen in that hallway. She nodded several times and wrote notes on a small pad she pulled from her jacket. A Connecticut detective appeared on her phone screen through a video call, his gray hair and tired eyes filling the display. He confirmed that Jennifer Hartley was indeed wanted for questioning in a cold case. The husband's family had never stopped pushing for answers, and new evidence had emerged last year. Swift's expression stayed professional, but I saw satisfaction in her eyes. Harrison had much bigger problems now than the helper program. Her lawyer was already on his phone, probably calling a criminal defense specialist who handled interstate cases. Harrison broke down, her perfect makeup running with tears that might have been real or calculated. She started blaming the other VIP mothers, saying the helper program was their idea, and she just went along with it. Security Chief Lewis pulled out his tablet and played more footage, this time showing emails. Harrison had pitched the helper program to the other mothers 6 months ago, selling it as a way to teach gratitude while pocketing the VIP fees. The emails showed her calculating costs and profits, setting up payment systems and recruiting families for both the VIP and helper tiers. She'd made this her business model, monetizing sick children's suffering while pretending to support charity causes. The other VIP mothers watched the emails appear on Lewis's screen, and their faces showed panic as they realized Harrison had documented everything. The other VIP mothers started moving away from Jennifer, their designer handbags clutched tight against their bodies. One woman in a white sundress pulled out her phone and made a call, speaking in urgent whispers about needing her attorney immediately. Another mother grabbed her daughter's hand and pushed through the crowd toward the exit, not looking back at the chaos she was leaving behind. The third VIP mother stood frozen near the office door, her face pale as she watched the security footage play again on Lewis's tablet. Her lawyer appeared within minutes, a man in an expensive suit who immediately started talking about his client's limited involvement and her willingness to cooperate fully with any investigation. The white sundress woman's lawyer arrived next, then another, until the hallway filled with expensive legal representation, all trying to distance their clients from Jennifer. They spoke in careful legal language about misunderstandings and misrepresentations, claiming Jennifer had told them the helper program was a voluntary character-building opportunity approved by Make-A-Wish and Disney management. One lawyer produced text messages showing Jennifer describing the program as teaching gratitude and work ethic to children from disadvantaged backgrounds. Another had emails where Jennifer assured parents that all activities were supervised and age-appropriate, with no mention of 8-hour labor shifts or denial of basic needs. The lawyers formed a protective barrier around their clients, while simultaneously throwing Jennifer under every bus they could find. I watched their faces as they realized Jennifer had documented her entire operation in those emails, creating a paper trail that implicated everyone who paid into her system. Swift pulled on latex gloves and picked up Jennifer's designer purse from the security desk, dumping its contents onto a clean section of the table. Lipstick, wallet, keys, breath mints, and a small leather notebook tumbled out. Swift opened the notebook carefully, photographing each page with her phone before reading aloud. The notebook contained detailed plans for expanding the helper program to other charity events across Florida and eventually nationwide. Jennifer had written contact information for coordinators at various children's charities, with notes about which organizations had the most desperate families and the least oversight. One page listed potential venues with capacity estimates and projected revenue per event. Another page broke down the cost structure, showing how much to charge VIP families versus how little to spend on helper children, with profit margins calculated in neat columns. Swift's voice got quieter as she read notes about targeting families who were immigrants or single parents, people Jennifer described as less likely to complain or understand their rights. The notebook showed Jennifer had already run similar schemes at 3 other charity events in the past 6 months, collecting VIP fees while sick children provided unpaid labor. One entry described a cancer research fundraiser where helper kids served food to donors for 6 hours. Another detailed a diabetes awareness event where children in wheelchairs were made to hand out pamphlets in the summer heat. Swift photographed every page methodically, while Jennifer's lawyer tried to argue the notebook was personal property that couldn't be seized without a warrant. Swift ignored him and kept photographing, her jaw set in a hard line. Tommy's father stood near the back of the security office, a thin man with glasses and the exhausted look of someone who'd spent months in the hospital waiting rooms. He wore a Make-A-Wish volunteer shirt and khaki shorts, his phone in his hand as he stared at Jennifer with an expression I couldn't quite read. When everyone's attention focused on Swift reading from the notebook, Tommy's father moved closer to where Jennifer's laptop sat open on the security desk. His fingers moved across the keyboard with quick confidence, the muscle memory of someone who spent their life working with computers. Security Chief Lewis noticed but didn't stop him, just shifted his position to block the view from Jennifer's lawyer. Tommy's father's face changed as he read whatever appeared on the screen, his expression shifting from tired sadness to pure rage. He turned the laptop so Swift could see, and she stopped reading from the notebook to look at the spreadsheet displayed on the screen. The spreadsheet tracked helper program revenue across multiple charity events with dates, locations, number of VIP families, fees collected, and expenses. The expenses column showed minimal costs for helper children, mostly the vests and some basic supplies, while the revenue column showed thousands of dollars per event. Tommy's father scrolled down, revealing 6 months of data showing Jennifer had collected over $200,000 by monetizing sick children's labor at charity events that were supposed to help those same children. One tab in the spreadsheet listed future events already scheduled, with projected revenue that would have brought her total to $500,000 by year's end. Another tab contained contact information for families, separated into VIP tier and helper tier, with notes about each family's financial situation and likelihood of complaints. The room went completely silent as everyone processed the scope of what Jennifer had built. She hadn't just exploited children at one Disney event, she'd created an entire business model around turning charity into profit by making the most vulnerable children serve the wealthy ones. Lewis looked sick as he scrolled through more spreadsheet tabs, showing Jennifer's systematic approach to identifying desperate families through charity organizations, then offering them access to wish events in exchange for their children's labor. She'd targeted families dealing with cancer, diabetes, genetic disorders, and terminal illnesses, people so grateful for any opportunity that they'd accept terms they'd never agree to under normal circumstances. The spreadsheet showed she'd refined her pitch over time, learning which phrases convinced families to participate and which red flags to avoid mentioning. She'd built relationships with charity coordinators by making generous donations, then used that access to recruit both VIP and helper families. Disney was just her biggest venue because it offered the most profit potential, but she'd been running smaller versions of this scheme for months at hospitals, fundraisers, and awareness events. One tab listed potential expansion cities with notes about which had the wealthiest donor bases and the least regulatory oversight. Jennifer had turned suffering into a franchise opportunity, and she'd gotten careless at Disney because she thought the corporation's desire to avoid bad publicity would protect her. Jameson sat in a chair against the wall with the victim advocate beside him, a kind-faced woman who'd given him juice and crackers while the adults argued. Swift knelt down in front of Jameson, her voice gentle but professional, as she explained she needed to hear what happened in his own words. Jameson looked at me and I nodded, giving him permission to tell the truth. His voice came out steady despite being only 9 years old, describing the helper program with the clear detail of a child who'd paid close attention to injustice. He told Swift about watching Tommy struggle to lift a trash bag that was almost as big as he was, how Tommy's hands shook from weakness, and he had to stop 3 times to rest. He described Luis carrying heavy backpacks in the heat, sweat soaking through his helper vest until his lips went white and he stumbled. He talked about Amanda pushing a wheelchair for a girl who could walk fine, but whose mother paid extra for the service. Amanda's thin arms trembling from the effort, until she finally sat down crying that she couldn't do it anymore. Jameson explained how the helper kids weren't allowed to eat until all the VIP kids finished their meals, and by then the food was cold and there wasn't much left. He described being told to stand behind barriers during the parade, holding bags and souvenirs while the VIP kids got front row spots and character interactions. His voice cracked when he talked about Tommy reaching for Mickey Mouse, this little kid with cancer who just wanted one hug before he died, and security pushing him back saying character time was for VIP wristbands only. Jameson said he felt something break inside him when the adults laughed at Tommy crying, like a wire snapping in his chest, and he couldn't think about anything except making them stop hurting his friend. Swift wrote down everything, asking specific questions about timing and who said what, treating Jameson's statement with the same seriousness she'd given adult witness. A man in a gray suit arrived carrying a briefcase with Child Protective Services printed on the side, introducing himself as Etienne Harvey. He had a calm, measured way of speaking that seemed designed to put scared children at ease, and he started by talking to Jameson about his favorite subjects in the school before asking about the helper program. Harvey interviewed each of the helper children separately, taking detailed notes about their experiences and photographing the helper vests and any visible injuries. Luis had blisters on his hands from carrying bags, Amanda had bruises on her arms from pushing the wheelchair, and Jose had a heat rash across his shoulders from working in the sun all day. Harvey's preliminary assessment took about an hour, during which he consulted with Swift and reviewed the evidence Lewis had collected. When he emerged from his interviews, his professional calm had shifted to barely controlled anger. He told Swift that the helper program constituted child exploitation under Florida law because children were required to perform labor in exchange for access to an event that was supposed to be a charitable gift. The fact that labor was exchanged for access to the wish fulfillment elevated this beyond simple negligence into potential trafficking territory, since the children's participation wasn't truly voluntary when their families were told it was required for the Make-A-Wish experience. Harvey's report stated that all helper children showed signs of physical exhaustion, emotional distress, and potential trauma from being systematically treated as servants. He recommended immediate intervention and long-term counseling for every child involved, and his language made clear this was now a felony investigation. The Disney legal team had been huddled in Solomon Knight's office making urgent phone calls, but now they emerged looking like people who'd just accepted their worst nightmare was real. The lead attorney, a woman with steel gray hair and an expression that suggested she'd handled corporate disasters before, asked to speak with Swift privately. They talked in low voices near the security monitors while the rest of us waited, and I watched the attorney's face shift from damage control mode to throwing Jennifer under the bus completely. When they returned, the attorney made a formal statement for the record, claiming that Jennifer Harrison had misrepresented the helper program to the park management, telling them it was an approved Make-A-Wish volunteer opportunity where children earned special recognition pins. She produced emails showing Jennifer's communications with Disney staff, carefully edited messages that made the program sound like a character-building activity rather than child labor. The attorney claimed cast members were following what they believed were legitimate protocols provided by Make-A-Wish Foundation, and that Disney had no knowledge of the exploitation until Jameson's actions brought it to light. She announced Disney would cooperate fully with law enforcement, provide all requested documentation, and implement immediate policy changes to prevent similar situations. The attorney's carefully worded statement put all blame on Jennifer while positioning Disney as a victim of her deception, and I realized they'd made the calculation that protecting the corporation meant sacrificing her completely. Swift pulled out her handcuffs and approached Jennifer, who'd been sitting in shocked silence since Tommy's father found her spreadsheets. Swift read Jennifer her rights in a clear voice that carried through the security office, the familiar words from TV shows suddenly real and immediate. Jennifer was arrested on the Connecticut warrant for questioning in her first husband's death, with additional charges pending for the helper program exploitation. As Swift clicked the handcuffs around Jennifer's wrists, Jennifer started screaming that I'd ruined everything, that she'd built something profitable, and I'd destroyed it out of jealousy. Her voice went high and desperate as she yelled that Jameson was a violent psychopath, and I was an unemployed loser who couldn't handle seeing successful people. Swift guided her toward the door while Jennifer kept screaming, her perfect makeup streaked with tears and her expensive clothes rumpled from hours in the security office. I stepped into her path and spoke quietly enough that only she could hear, telling her that Jameson ruined her operation by being braver than any adult in that park. And I just made sure she couldn't run away and start over somewhere else like she did after killing her husband. Jennifer's face twisted with pure hatred, all her careful mask completely gone, and she spat at me before Swift pulled her through the door. I watched her disappear down the hallway in handcuffs, this woman who'd turned children's suffering into profit and felt nothing but relief that she couldn't hurt anyone else. The other VIP mothers stood with their lawyers in a tight cluster near the exit, their faces showing various levels of panic as they realized they might face charges too. Swift approached them with her notebook and explained they were all potentially liable for child exploitation since they'd paid into Jennifer's system and benefited from the helper children's labor. The lawyers immediately started negotiating, offering cooperation agreements where their clients would testify against Jennifer and pay restitution to the helper families in exchange for reduced charges. I watched justice bend in real time as wealth bought better outcomes. These women who'd laughed while watching children suffer on camera, now getting deals because they could afford expensive legal representation. Swift looked disgusted, but accepted the cooperation agreements, knowing that securing testimony against Jennifer was more important than pursuing maximum charges against everyone involved. The VIP mothers would face misdemeanor charges and community service, would pay money to the families they'd exploited, and would be barred from participating in charity events, but they wouldn't see jail time. Their lawyers shepherded them out quickly before anyone could change their minds, and the hallway emptied of designer handbags and expensive perfume. Tommy's parents approached me with tears running down their faces, the kind of crying that comes from guilt and gratitude mixed together. Tommy's mother grabbed my hands and thanked Jameson for being brave enough to act when all the adults had failed, her voice breaking on every word. She said they'd been in the VIP viewing area enjoying special treatment, while their son emptied trash cans, and they'd never forgive themselves for not knowing what was happening. Tommy's father said Jameson was the hero his son needed, someone who saw injustice and refused to accept it, even when it cost him everything. They asked if Tommy could meet Jameson, if their son could thank him personally for standing up when no one else would. I looked at the victim advocate who'd been sitting with Jameson, and she nodded that a brief supervised meeting would be appropriate. I walked over to Jameson and knelt down, telling him that Tommy wanted to see him, and Jameson's face lit up with the first real smile I'd seen since this whole nightmare started. The victim advocate brought Jameson over, and he sat down next to Tommy on the small couch in the corner of the security office. Both boys looked tiny and exhausted, their nice clothes from this morning now rumpled and stained. Tommy's Make-A-Wish shirt had a tear across the front, and Jameson's knuckles were still wrapped in gauze from punching through fiberglass. They sat in silence for a moment, just two 9-year-olds who'd seen adults fail in ways that shouldn't be possible. Tommy spoke first, his voice quiet but steady despite everything he'd been through that day. He told Jameson he was his hero, that nobody had ever stood up for him like that before. Jameson's face crumpled and tears started rolling down his cheeks, the first time he'd cried since this whole thing started. He said he was just so angry that they hurt Tommy, that they made him empty trash cans when he should have been meeting Mickey Mouse. Tommy reached over and hugged Jameson, and Jameson hugged him back, both of them shaking as they cried together. Every adult in that security office was trying not to break down watching these two kids comfort each other after what Harrison had put them through. I wiped my eyes and looked away, giving them their moment while my heart felt like it was squeezed in my chest. A commotion near the entrance made everyone turn as a man in his 30s pushed past the security guard, holding up a press badge. He introduced himself as Will Wynn from the Orlando Sentinel and said someone inside Disney security had tipped him off about what happened here today. He'd been investigating charity event problems for months, tracking complaints and weird patterns in how some organizations operated their fundraisers. Harrison's arrest was exactly the break he needed to prove what he'd been suspecting about exploitation at these events. He looked at me with sharp eyes and asked if I'd be willing to talk about what Jameson saw, what the helper program really was. I felt everyone in the room watching me, waiting to see if I'd let this become public or keep it contained. Disney's lawyers shifted uncomfortably, and the security chief looked nervous. I thought about Harrison's face when Swift arrested her, about Tommy crying while holding Mickey's souvenirs, about Luis collapsing from heat and Amanda's blistered hands. Then I looked at Jameson and Tommy still hugging on that couch, and I knew what needed to happen. I told Wynn I needed to talk to the other helper families first, before making any decisions about going public. Luis's parents, Amanda's grandmother and Jose's father, all gathered in a corner of the security office, while Disney's lawyers watched with obvious concern. We spoke quietly about what silence would mean versus what publicity might cost us and our kids. Amanda's grandmother said it plainly, that silence protects predators like Harrison and lets them move on to hurt other families somewhere else. Luis's mother agreed, saying her son almost died from heat exhaustion today, and if we stayed quiet, some other child might actually die next time. Jose's father nodded and said Harrison needed to face consequences beyond just the Connecticut charges, that the helper program itself needed to be exposed. We all looked at our kids sitting together now, Jameson and Tommy joined by Luis, Amanda, and Jose, 5 children who'd formed a bond through shared trauma. I walked back to Wynn and told him we'd give him interviews if he promised to focus on the bigger problems, instead of just sensationalizing Jameson's meltdown. He agreed immediately and said he'd treat our children with dignity in his reporting, that his goal was preventing future exploitation, not creating clickbait headlines. My phone rang 3 hours later while Jameson and I were finally heading to our car in the parking lot. The number had a Connecticut area code, and when I answered, a woman's voice asked if I was the father of the boy who exposed Jennifer Harrison. She introduced herself as Gabriella Pope, Harrison's ex-husband's sister, and said she'd been trying to prove Harrison killed her brother for 15 years. The Connecticut police had dismissed her evidence as circumstantial and grief-driven conspiracy theories. But now with Harrison's arrest making news, maybe someone would finally listen. She had boxes of documentation, financial records, witness statements, everything she'd collected over the years while Harrison started over with a new name and new victims. I leaned against my car and listened as Gabriella's voice shook with 15 years of frustration and grief. She said her brother had discovered Harrison's charity fraud right before his convenient accident, that he'd told Gabriella he was going to report her to authorities. 3 days later, he was dead in what police ruled an accidental fall down the stairs, and Harrison collected a massive life insurance payout before disappearing. Now Gabriella finally had a second chance at justice because Harrison's pattern was undeniable with the helper program added to the evidence. Gabriella drove down from Connecticut overnight and met me at a diner near our apartment the next morning. She brought 3 banker's boxes full of documents and spread them across the table while Jameson ate pancakes at the counter. The papers showed Harrison's pattern clearly once you knew what to look for, how she infiltrated charity organizations by volunteering first, then identifying vulnerable families who were grateful and unlikely to complain. She'd run schemes at cancer fundraisers, disability awareness events, foster care charity dinners, always finding ways to exploit the people these organizations were supposed to help. The helper program was just her latest and most bold operation, but the core pattern remained the same. Gabriella showed me financial records proving Harrison had made over $200,000 in 6 months through various exploitation schemes. Her dead husband had discovered discrepancies in a charity auction Harrison was running, money that should have gone to families in need, but ended up in Harrison's accounts instead. He'd confronted her and told Gabriella he was gathering evidence to take to police. Then came the stairs, the insurance payout, and Harrison vanishing to start over somewhere new with a different name. The story broke online at 6 a.m. the next morning with a headline that made my phone start buzzing immediately. Make-A-Wish exploitation ring busted at Disney World appeared on the Orlando Sentinel website with Wynn's byline and detailed reporting about everything that happened. My phone exploded with calls and texts from reporters, morning shows, news networks, everyone wanting interviews and statements. I ignored most of them and turned my phone to silent while Jameson got ready for what we'd agreed to do. Wynn had arranged one televised interview with a local news station if they included Tommy's family and focused on preventing future exploitation rather than just sensationalizing the destruction. The producer had agreed and promised to handle it sensitively, given that children were involved. Jameson was nervous but determined as we drove to the studio, practicing what he wanted to say about why he did what he did. Disney released their official statement while we were in the makeup room at the news station. Their PR team had worked overnight crafting careful language that condemned Harrison while positioning Disney as a victim of her deception. They announced a complete review of all charity event protocols and promised independent oversight going forward. The statement offered free lifetime passes to all helper families and established a victims fund to help with medical bills and other expenses. It felt like damage control, and I knew that's exactly what it was, but I also couldn't ignore that it was real money for families struggling to pay for cancer treatments and hospital stays. Luis's parents would get help with his ongoing medical expenses from the heat exhaustion. Amanda's grandmother could focus on her granddaughter's bone cancer treatment without worrying about bills. Tommy's family would have financial support for his leukemia care. The cynic in me knew Disney was buying goodwill and preventing lawsuits, but the father in me was grateful that these families would have some relief. The backlash against Disney came hard and fast, despite their attempts at damage control. Social media exploded with people canceling their trips and demanding accountability for how the helper program operated under Disney's supervision for an entire day without anyone stopping it. The hashtag about the exploitation started trending, and suddenly cast members were coming forward with their own stories. They posted about being told to ignore helper kids, about management instructions to only interact with purple wristband families, about feeling uncomfortable but being afraid to speak up and lose their jobs. Former employees shared similar experiences from other charity events, suggesting this wasn't just Harrison's scheme, but something that Disney's structure had enabled through their focus on VIP experiences. The company's stock dropped, and their crisis management team was working overtime, but the damage was spreading faster than they could contain it. Jameson and I sat on the studio couch together for the interview, and he was calm and clear as he explained what he saw that day. The interviewer was gentle with him, but asked direct questions about the helper program and what made him snap. Jameson described watching Tommy cry while being denied access to Mickey Mouse, seeing Luis collapse from carrying bags in the heat, hearing Amanda beg for water, and being told helpers had to wait. He talked about the moment when they announced the fireworks were VIP only, and Make-A-Wish kids had to leave early, about knowing Tommy wouldn't live to see another fireworks show. The interviewer asked the question everyone wanted answered, whether Jameson regretted destroying the parade float and attacking the goofy performer. Jameson looked directly at the camera and said he regretted that destroying property was the only way to make adults pay attention to suffering children, that he wished someone in charge had stopped the helper program before it got to that point. His answer was perfect and devastating, and I watched the interviewer's eyes get wet as she thanked him for his courage. The interview aired that evening and went viral within hours. People shared it across every social media platform with comments calling Jameson a hero and praising his moral clarity. Support campaigns started appearing with hashtags about defending children and exposing exploitation. Someone created a fund for Jameson's family that raised thousands of dollars before I even knew it existed. The narrative shifted completely from violent child destroys Disney to child defender exposes systemic exploitation, and suddenly Jameson wasn't a problem to be managed, but a symbol of standing up for vulnerable people. Tommy's parents called me crying happy tears because people were finally understanding what really happened that day. The other helper families sent messages about feeling vindicated and heard. Even strangers on the internet were posting about how Jameson did what adults should have done, how his rage was justified and his actions necessary. I sat with Jameson that night watching the responses pour in, and he asked me if people really thought he was brave or if they were just being nice. I told him the truth, that what he did took more courage than most adults ever show, and that he'd changed things for children who needed someone to fight for them. 3 days after the interview went viral, Disney's legal team called with a settlement offer. They wanted to drop all damage claims against Jameson and issue a formal apology. The lawyer on the phone sounded tired, like he'd been fighting this battle for days and finally lost. He explained that Disney would admit their protocols failed to protect vulnerable children and announce policy changes including independent oversight of all charity events. Cast members would receive mandatory reporting training. The victims' fund they'd already announced would be expanded. I sat at my kitchen table listening to him list everything they were offering, and I knew it was damage control, but I also knew it was real change that might protect other kids. Jameson was at the school when I took the call, and I agreed to the settlement because fighting Disney in court for years wouldn't help anyone. The formal apology came 2 days later in a press release that made national news. Disney acknowledged that their supervision of the charity event was inadequate and that children were exploited under their watch. They promised to implement new safeguards and work with child advocacy organizations to prevent future incidents. The internet exploded again with people saying it wasn't enough, while others praised Disney for taking responsibility. I didn't care about the debate because the policy changes were real and documented, and that mattered more than public opinion. Connecticut filed formal charges against Jennifer Harrison the same week. The prosecutor called to explain that they were charging her with insurance fraud and filing false reports in her first husband's death. Gabriella's preserved evidence became crucial to their case. She'd kept copies of her brother's financial records, showing the life insurance policy change, photos of the accident scene that didn't match Harrison's story, and witness statements from neighbors who heard them fighting the night before he died. Harrison's lawyer tried to argue she was persecuted because of the helper program scandal, but the prosecution connected her charity fraud pattern to motive for murder. They showed the jury how she'd been running exploitation schemes for years, always targeting vulnerable people, always profiting from others' suffering. The helper program evidence established her character and made the murder charges more believable. I followed the case through news reports and occasional calls from the prosecutor, who wanted my perspective on Harrison's behavior patterns. Luis's parents called me a week after the settlement to suggest forming a support group for the helper families. We started meeting every Thursday evening at the community center, just the parents at first, talking about what our kids went through and how to help them heal. Amanda's grandmother joined and brought policy recommendations she'd been writing for charity organizations. Jose's father came and talked about speaking at conferences to teach people the warning signs of exploitation. We became a tight unit, these families bonded by trauma and determination to prevent it from happening to others. Luis's parents were pursuing legal action against Harrison personally for their son's heat exhaustion and ongoing medical issues. Amanda's grandmother was working with state legislators on stronger protections. Jose's father was becoming a sought-after speaker at nonprofit conferences. We met every week and processed our anger and guilt and fear together, and slowly we all started healing. Jameson started therapy with a child psychologist who specialized in trauma from witnessing injustice. She was patient and kind, and she explained things in ways that helped both of us understand what happened. She told me that Jameson's rage came from a deeply moral place, that his instinct to protect vulnerable people were something to nurture and channel appropriately. She worked with him on recognizing injustice without letting it overwhelm him, on finding constructive ways to advocate for others, on processing the trauma of watching children suffer while adults did nothing. Jameson liked her, and he started opening up about how scared he was watching Tommy cry, how helpless he felt seeing Luis collapse, how angry he got when adults laughed at suffering children. She taught him breathing techniques and journaling and ways to express his feelings without destroying things. I sat in on some sessions and learned how to support him better, how to validate his moral instincts while teaching him appropriate responses. Make-A-Wish Foundation launched their own internal investigation into how Harrison operated through their organization for months without detection. They discovered she'd manipulated their screening processes and forged approval documents to run her exploitation schemes. She'd been using their name and reputation to access vulnerable families, then creating tiered systems that turned charity into profit. The foundation was horrified and immediately implemented new safeguards, including family feedback systems and unannounced event monitoring. They sent representatives to meet with all the helper families personally to apologize and explain the changes they were making. They established a hotline for reporting concerns and hired independent auditors to review all large events. The foundation president called me directly to apologize and ask for input on their new policies, and I spent an hour on the phone explaining what would have prevented the helper program from happening. Tommy's health declined, and he was hospitalized again 3 weeks after the interview aired. His parents called to tell me, and their voices were shaking with fear and exhaustion. They asked if they could bring Tommy photos of Jameson in the viral interview because he kept asking to see them. I printed everything I could find and drove to the hospital that same day. Tommy was in a pediatric oncology ward, pale and thin with an IV dripping chemotherapy into his arm. But his face lit up when he saw the photos, and he told the nurses that Jameson was his best friend, even though they only met once. He said knowing someone fought for him made the cancer treatments less scary, that when the medicine made him feel awful, he thought about Jameson destroying that parade float, and it helped him be brave. His parents cried while he talked, and I had to leave the room for a minute to compose myself. Tommy taped the photos to the wall beside his bed where he could see them during treatments. Job offers started arriving in my email, and I was shocked that anyone wanted to hire me. 3 different advocacy organizations reached out saying they were impressed by how I handled the media and protected the children's dignity throughout the crisis. They'd watched me navigate the interviews and legal process while keeping Jameson's well-being as the priority. One was a child welfare nonprofit focused on preventing exploitation in charity organizations. Another worked on strengthening protective services systems. The third advocated for families navigating legal issues involving children. I interviewed with all 3 and accepted the position with the child welfare nonprofit because their mission aligned perfectly with what we'd been through. The salary was modest, but it was steady income for the first time in months, and the work felt meaningful. I'd be investigating charity organizations, developing safety protocols, and training staff to recognize exploitation. My experience with the helper program made me uniquely qualified, and I started 2 weeks later. Harrison's trial for the Connecticut charges began 4 months after her arrest. Gabriella testified about her brother's suspicions before his death, how he'd discovered Harrison's charity fraud and confronted her, how he'd planned to report her to authorities. She brought documentation showing Harrison had been running donation scams through multiple organizations, pocketing money meant for cancer research and children's programs. The prosecution connected Harrison's charity fraud pattern to motive for murder, arguing she killed him to prevent exposure. Gabriella was calm and precise on the witness stand, years of grief and determination focused into devastating testimony. Harrison's lawyer tried to discredit her, but the helper program evidence had already established Harrison's pattern of exploiting vulnerable people. I attended the trial when I could, and watching Harrison squirm on the witness stand felt like watching karma work slowly but thoroughly. Her mask was completely gone now, replaced by barely contained rage at being caught. Jameson returned to the school and faced mixed reactions from classmates and their parents. Some parents thought he was a hero, and their kids wanted to be friends with him. Others worried he was violent and dangerous and told their children to stay away. The principal called me in for a meeting to discuss how to handle the situation, and Jameson's teacher suggested he give a presentation about standing up for others. We agreed, and Jameson spent a week preparing with his therapist's help. He gave his presentation to the whole 4th grade, explaining what he saw at Disney and why he reacted the way he did. He talked about recognizing injustice and finding appropriate ways to help people who are being hurt. His classmates asked thoughtful questions about when it's right to break rules and how to know if you're helping or making things worse. Some kids shared their own experiences with bullying and standing up for friends. The presentation shifted how other students saw Jameson, from scary kid who destroyed Disney to someone who defended people who couldn't defend themselves. The Make-A-Wish mother who originally invited Jameson's class to the Disney trip apologized publicly 2 weeks after Harrison's trial started. She gave an interview admitting she was so focused on her son's experience that she didn't see the exploitation happening right in front of her. She said she trusted Harrison to organize everything and never questioned the helper program because Harrison presented it as a volunteer opportunity. She cried during the interview and said she'd failed the children who were exploited while she enjoyed VIP treatment. She became an advocate for equity and wish fulfillment after that, working with Make-A-Wish to ensure all families receive the same quality experience, regardless of ability to pay. She joined our support group and sat quietly at first, listening to the helper families process their trauma. Eventually, she started sharing her own guilt and grief, and we helped her heal too because holding on to anger wouldn't help anyone. Disney's lawyers contacted the helper families separately over the following weeks with settlement offers. Luis's parents called me from their kitchen table, voices thick with emotion as they explained the number on the paper in front of them. They wouldn't say the exact amount because of the agreement they signed, but Luis's mother kept repeating that his medical bills were covered for years, maybe longer. Luis needed regular checkups for the heat damage to his kidneys, and now they could afford specialists instead of the free clinic. Amanda's grandmother negotiated differently than the others, refusing to sign until Disney agreed to specific policy changes with enforcement mechanisms. She wanted independent monitors at charity events, mandatory background checks for coordinators, and a hotline for participants to report concerns without retaliation. Her settlement included financial compensation, but she cared more about the reforms, telling me on the phone that money couldn't erase what happened to Amanda, but preventing future exploitation might give it meaning. Jose's father got a college fund established for his son, managed by a trust that Disney couldn't touch or reduce. He cried when he told me because Jose talked about being a teacher someday, and now that dream had real financial backing instead of just hope. Harrison's trial for the Connecticut charges started on a cold morning in November. I drove 3 hours to testify, Jameson staying with Luis's family for the day. The courthouse was old brick with marble floors that echoed when you walked, and cameras lined the steps outside because the case had gotten national attention after the Disney incident. The prosecutor met me in a witness room and reviewed my testimony, explaining how my account of Harrison's reaction would establish consciousness of guilt. Gabriella sat in the gallery looking tired but determined, clutching a folder of documents about her brother. When I took the stand, the prosecutor asked me to describe the moment I said Harrison's real name at Disney. I explained watching her face drain of color, how she collapsed against the security desk, how she demanded to know how I knew that name. The jury watched footage of that moment on screens throughout the courtroom, Harrison's mask cracking in high definition as her past caught up with her present. Her lawyer tried to discredit me during cross-examination, suggesting I was biased because of Jameson's actions, but the footage spoke louder than any argument. You could see Harrison's guilty knowledge written across her face in that security office, the panic of someone whose carefully constructed lies were falling apart. The jury convicted Harrison on 7 counts of fraud and 2 counts of filing false police reports. The judge sentenced her to 10 years with additional charges pending for the helper program exploitation, and as the bailiffs led her away in handcuffs, she turned and stared at me with pure hatred. Her eyes promised revenge if she ever got the chance, but all I felt was relief that she couldn't hurt more children from prison. Gabriella hugged me in the courthouse hallway afterward, tears streaming down her face as she thanked me for giving her brother justice after 15 years. The Connecticut detective who worked the case shook my hand and admitted they'd given up on ever finding Harrison, that she disappeared too completely until Jameson's actions at Disney put her name back in the system. Tommy's parents called 2 weeks later inviting Jameson and me to visit him at the hospital. Tommy's leukemia treatment was aggressive, and he spent most days in a pediatric oncology ward that tried too hard to be cheerful with painted murals and bright curtains. We brought video games and snacks the nurses approved, and when we walked into Tommy's room, his face transformed. He looked smaller than I remembered, thinner, with dark circles under his eyes and an IV pole next to his bed, but he smiled so wide when he saw Jameson, reaching out for a hug despite the tubes in his arm. They set up a racing game on the TV and played for 2 hours while chemotherapy dripped into Tommy's veins, Jameson patient and gentle in ways that made my throat tight. He let Tommy win sometimes, but not obviously, keeping the competition real enough to matter. Tommy laughed until he got tired, then they switched to quieter games and Jameson told him stories about school, while Tommy's eyes drooped. Before we left, Tommy grabbed Jameson's hand and told him he was the bravest person he'd ever met, and Jameson said Tommy was braver for fighting cancer every single day. The other VIP mothers faced misdemeanor charges for their participation in the helper program. Their lawyers were expensive and skilled, negotiating plea deals that resulted in community service and probation instead of jail time. It wasn't perfect justice, and it made me angry watching them walk out of court with minimal consequences, while Harrison got years. But they were publicly shamed in ways that mattered in their social circles. Their names attached forever to child exploitation in news articles and court records. The charity organizations they'd worked with banned them from future participation, and their friends stopped inviting them to fundraisers and galas. Sometimes social consequences cut deeper than legal ones, especially for people who valued status above everything else. Their children faced questions at the school about what their mothers did, and several families moved to different districts to escape the attention. Jameson's school invited me to speak at an assembly about advocacy and standing up for others. I was nervous standing on the gymnasium stage in front of 300 students, but Jameson sat in the front row beaming with pride, and that steadied me. I explained that heroes come in all sizes and ages, that recognizing injustice and acting on it matters more than being perfect. I told them about the helper program and why Jameson reacted the way he did, emphasizing that while destruction wasn't the right method, defending vulnerable people were always the right instinct. The principal announced a new program inspired by Jameson's actions, focusing on teaching students to identify and respond to bullying and unfair treatment. They'd have peer mediators and anonymous reporting systems, with training for staff on recognizing exploitation. Several kids raised their hands during questions, asking how they could help friends who were being hurt, and their genuine concern gave me hope that Jameson's explosion might create ripples of positive change. Will won a regional journalism award for his investigative series on charity event exploitation. His articles traced Harrison's pattern across multiple organizations and sparked conversations about regulation and oversight. He credited Jameson and the helper families in his acceptance speech, calling them courageous for speaking truth when institutions wanted silence. His reporting caught the attention of state legislators who started drafting bills to regulate charity event labor practices. I got a call from a committee aide inviting me to testify about the need for stronger protections, and I agreed immediately because this was a chance to turn Jameson's rage into lasting policy change. I testified alongside Amanda's grandmother in front of a packed committee room at the state capitol. We described the helper program in detail, explained how Harrison exploited gaps in oversight, and proposed specific reforms, including mandatory background checks for charity event coordinators and reporting systems for participants to flag concerns. Amanda's grandmother presented her legal analysis of existing laws and their failures, while I spoke about the human cost of exploitation and how it damaged children who were already vulnerable. Several legislators asked pointed questions about enforcement and funding, and we had answers prepared because we'd done our research. 3 months later, the bill passed with bipartisan support, officially named the Helper Protection Act. Knowing Jameson's destructive act at Disney created legislation that would protect future children helped both of us process what happened. His therapist said channeling trauma into constructive change was healthy healing, and watching him follow news coverage of the bill with pride showed he understood his actions mattered beyond that one day. Tommy's condition stabilized enough that his doctors cleared him to attend a special Disney event organized specifically for the helper families. Disney wanted to make amends in a tangible way, and they planned a private day at the park with no VIP tiers, no service requirements, just pure access to everything for children who deserved it. Jameson and Tommy rode every ride together, Tommy wearing a hat to cover his hair loss from chemotherapy, but grinning nonstop. They met characters without barriers, ate whatever they wanted, and watched fireworks from the best viewing area in the park. Tommy held Jameson's hand during the castle show, both boys' faces lit by colored lights, and watching them laugh felt like witnessing resilience in its purest form. Luis ran between attractions with energy that proved his kidneys had healed. Amanda pushed her own wheelchair just to prove she could, and Jose collected autographs from every character he met. The parents gathered near the castle, and someone took a group photo that captured all of us smiling. The helper families transformed from exploited servants into honored guests. 6 months after the incident at Disney, all criminal cases were resolved and civil settlements finalized. Harrison sat in prison serving her 10-year sentence with additional charges still pending for the helper program exploitation across multiple states. The helper families had financial security for medical expenses and futures, trust funds and college accounts and medical coverage that removed constant worry about affording treatment. Disney implemented the Helper Protection Act standards nationwide across all their properties before the law even required it, with independent monitors attending charity events and cast members trained to recognize and report exploitation. Luis's parents bought a house with a yard. Amanda's grandmother retired from her advocacy work, knowing she'd created lasting change, and Jose's father got promoted after his employer saw news coverage of his courage speaking out. Jameson and I moved into a better apartment paid for by my nonprofit salary, and he decorated his room with photos of Tommy and the other helper kids, physical reminders that his explosion of rage had protected real children and created real change in systems that had failed them. I moved boxes into our new apartment while Jameson mapped out his room. The nonprofit job paid enough for 2 bedrooms and windows that actually opened. Jameson taped photos across one wall, Tommy grinning despite his bald head, Luis with his arm around Jose, Amanda in her wheelchair surrounded by the other helper kids. He stepped back to examine his work and nodded like he'd built something important. "Dad, I think I want to be a lawyer." I set down a box of kitchen stuff and looked at him. "Yeah? So I can fight for people who can't fight for themselves, like Tommy and Luis and everyone." He touched one of the photos gently. "There's probably lots of kids who need someone to fight for them." I walked over and put my hand on his shoulder, looking at the wall of faces he'd protected. "You'll be incredible at it." Tommy's mom called 3 months later with news that made her voice shake. The cancer was gone, completely gone. The doctors found nothing in his latest scans, and they were using words like remission and cautiously optimistic. She told me that Jameson's friendship gave Tommy something to fight for during the worst treatments, that knowing someone cared enough to destroy a parade float for him made him want to live. They started visiting monthly. Tommy and Jameson would disappear into Jameson's room for hours, building things with blocks or playing games on my laptop. Sometimes I'd hear them talking about the Disney day, processing it together in ways adults couldn't. Their friendship grew beyond the trauma, becoming something real and lasting that had nothing to do with helper vests or parade floats. My supervisor called me into her office 6 months into the job. I thought I'd messed up a case file or missed a deadline. Instead, she offered me a promotion with my own caseload of families dealing with exploitation situations. I'd be the primary advocate for 15 families, helping them navigate systems that didn't care about them. Every time I met with a new family, I thought about Jameson destroying that float. His protective rage created ripples that kept spreading outward, touching people who'd never know his name. I channeled that same energy into systematic change, fighting institutions instead of smashing them, but the core was identical, refusing to accept that vulnerable people deserved less. The mayor's office called about an award ceremony. Jameson would receive a citizenship award for courage in exposing exploitation. I watched him practice his acceptance speech in the bathroom mirror, adjusting his tie and trying to sound serious. He was still 9 years old, still had a gap between his front teeth, but he carried himself differently now. The ceremony filled a room at City Hall with local officials and news cameras. Jameson walked to the podium in his best clothes, the same outfit he'd destroyed at Disney replaced with something newer. He gripped the microphone and looked out at everyone watching him. "I want to thank Tommy for being brave enough to reach for Mickey Mouse even when they told him he wasn't good enough. He's the real hero." I watched people wipe their eyes, saw Tommy's parents holding each other, noticed how the room went completely silent. My 9-year-old son had figured out something most adults never learned, that protecting others mattered more than following rules that protected nobody. Luis went back to the school without kidney problems. His parents sent me photos of him playing soccer, running without pain for the first time in months. Amanda's cancer treatment was working, and her grandmother reported good results from the latest tests. Jose's father got promoted after his company saw news coverage of his advocacy work, impressed that their employee had the courage to speak truth publicly. We met monthly, all the helper families together. The trauma bonded us into something beyond friendship, a chosen family that understood what we'd survived. We celebrated small victories and supported each other through setbacks, knowing we'd always have people who understood without explanation. Jameson's therapist asked to speak with me privately after one of his sessions. She told me he'd processed everything in remarkably healthy ways, that his sense of justice was channeling into school projects about fairness. He'd started a peer mediation program at the school, helping other kids resolve conflicts peacefully. He still got intensely angry at injustice, but he was learning to express it through words and action instead of destruction. She said most kids who experienced what Jameson saw would struggle for years. Instead, he'd turned it into purpose, into motivation to fix broken systems. The explosion at Disney wasn't trauma that damaged him. It was the moment he discovered who he was and what mattered to him. Tommy's family hosted a party on the anniversary of the incident. All the helper families gathered in their backyard, kids running around while parents talked about how far we'd come. Jameson and Tommy stood together in front of a cake with candles, both of them older now but still carrying what happened with them everywhere. They blew out the candles together and everyone cheered. Tommy leaned close to Jameson and whispered something I barely heard. "You saved my life. Not just from the helper program. You gave me a reason to keep fighting the cancer." Jameson hugged him tight, and I turned away before they could see me losing it. The letter from Gabriella arrived in a thick envelope with a Connecticut postmark. She thanked me for giving her brother's case new life, for helping her finally get justice after 15 years of people dismissing her concerns. Jennifer Harrison was in prison, and the truth was public, and her brother's name was cleared. Gabriella had established a foundation in her brother's name to investigate suspicious deaths connected to charity fraud. She wanted Jameson and me on her advisory board, helping guide the organization's work. I called her that night and accepted, knowing this was another ripple spreading outward from Jameson's explosion. Disney implemented the Helper Protection Act standards across all their properties nationwide before the law even required it. Other theme parks followed their lead, creating new protocols and training programs. Cast members reported feeling empowered to speak up about concerning situations instead of staying silent to protect the company. The culture shift meant Jameson's destruction created lasting institutional change. Kids visiting theme parks would never face what Tommy and Luis and Amanda and Jose experienced. The system was different now because one 9-year-old refused to accept cruelty as normal. We drove to Tommy's house for dinner on a Friday evening. His parents met us at the door with huge smiles and led us to the kitchen where they'd laid out Tommy's latest scans across the table. Completely clear, cancer-free. The doctors were cautiously optimistic about long-term remission, using phrases like excellent prognosis and minimal risk factors. Tommy grabbed Jameson's hand and pulled him toward his room. "You're my hero and my best friend." Jameson looked back at him seriously. "You're braver than anyone I know. You reached for Mickey even when they said you couldn't." I watched them disappear down the hallway, 2 kids who'd survived something terrible, and come out stronger, and I knew that whatever happened next, Jameson would spend his life fighting for people who needed someone in their corner. The nonprofit asked me to speak at a conference for child welfare organizations in Tampa, and I brought Jameson with me. He sat in the front row while I talked about recognizing exploitation in charity programs, and when I finished, the director asked if Jameson would share his perspective. He walked to the microphone without hesitation and told 200 professionals that adults miss things because they're focused on rules and appearances instead of watching how kids actually feel. He said Tommy's face when security pushed him away from Mickey told him everything he needed to know, and that adults should pay attention to children's faces more than permission forms. The room stayed silent for 10 seconds after he finished, then everyone stood up and clapped. 3 organizations asked if Jameson could speak at their events, and he looked at me with excitement I hadn't seen since before Disney. We did 4 more presentations over the next month, traveling to Atlanta and Charlotte and Richmond, and every time Jameson spoke, adults listened like they were hearing something important for the first time. We stood in our apartment on a Saturday morning, Jameson showing me the wall he'd covered with photos and newspaper clippings. Tommy grinned in the center picture, healthy and strong at his last checkup. Around him were photos from the Helper family gatherings, all of us together at parks and restaurants. The Helper Protection Act article was framed next to his citizenship award, and below that were thank you cards from Luis and Amanda and Jose. Jameson touched the frame holding his award and asked if I was proud of him even though he destroyed so much. I pulled him close and told him I'd never been more proud of anyone in my entire life. His heart saw what needed fixing when everyone else looked away, and his courage changed how vulnerable children would be treated everywhere. Sometimes breaking things is the only way to fix what's broken in systems that protect powerful people instead of powerless kids. He hugged me tight and whispered that he'd do it again if he had to, and I believed him completely.